Hi, welcome back. We're going to continue with our discussion of Book 4 of Plato's Republic. Last time we got to about the middle of Book 4. We were talking about justice, wisdom, courage, and moderation as those define, or as those are defined, excuse me, in a city. Now we're going to go on and talk about those same things: justice, wisdom, courage, and moderation. They're going to go on and talk about those things in relationship to the person. I'm actually not going to talk very much about that part, the ultimate thing they say about justice, wisdom, and moderation, and so on in the person. It's towards the end. It's interesting enough, worth reading. I might say something about it, but the thing I'm actually interested in is a little bit different. I'm interested in the account of what a person is that they give to set themselves up for being able to talk about wisdom and justice and moderation in the person and so on. And so thinking about that business in the city, right? You know, the distinction between these kinds of crafts that are people minding their own business and being sort of outward directed, but by doing that, they are doing work on behalf of the whole, but their perspective isn't about the whole, right? There's a differentiation between that whole world of endeavor and the kind of thing those people are doing, from this very different kind of thing that those making decisions about how the city should be run are what they're doing, and what's going on with the soldiers and so on. The point of that was to show that those are different kinds of things, and that the carrying out of those things isn't always automatically harmonious, right? All those other crafts are broadly what you would call economic life, right? They're the way people make a living, and make a living by doing productive things, that production of goods and services and so on, that are of value to other people, right? So that, in a way, that's what the division of labor is about. It's about economics, right? But what we've seen is that economics, in that sense, has to be differentiated from governance or government, and also from the military or whatever, which is a kind of subordinate arm of the government, but that is also not to be confused with governing per se. That's I think quite powerful and important. But anyway, as I said, the point is that differentiation is important, and while on the one hand you can imagine how those different things can be organized and functioning in such a way as to produce a good life, they don't automatically go that way. Right? And so it's not automatically the case that the relationship between these different essential functions of city and social life, it's not automatically the case that the relationship between them is the right one. There can be conflicts, there can be imbalances of power or authority or distribution of goods to one of the other classes. There can be people who handle their responsibilities in those different classes in an unsatisfactory way, etc., etc. And that's what then that discussion of justice and moderation, courage, etc. in the city is about. It's about how to understand getting those different facets, those different, essentially different, but essential facets of the social reality properly organized. So the point I want to underline there is that it points to, in the city, kind of essential division between these different dimensions of functioning. There are different sort of roles that are being carried out in the immediate life of the city. You don't really see; you just see people walking down the street, houses being built. But what all those people are doing is kind of enacting the fabric of this society, which at every moment is defined by all of those decisions that have been made by governing bodies, which are reflected in the very way people walk down the street, because they walk on the sidewalks, not in the middle of the road, right? Which is to say, they're respecting the law that says cars go there, people go here. And the cars drive in the right way down the road, the correct direction down the road. And you see cars parked. Well, that's because they're obeying parking laws, right? So, like, just in the things you'd see right outside you, nobody's really thinking about the laws, but you're seeing the laws being enacted, right? And so you're seeing the role of that governing body in the minute by minute activities of people on the street, right? So all of those things are happening all the time, right? That's the ongoing fabric of this thing, right? But in what sort of in action is kind of a single happening, a single reality, there are these essentially different functions being carried out, right? Well, so anyway, the point is that's what Socrates then says about the soul, about the person, right? You too, as a person, there's kind of a single happening that is the ongoing reality of your experience. You're experiencing, you're behaving, whatever else. Like this, there's the one stream of life that is you. But in that sort of single happening, there are different essential things happening, essential and essentially different things happening. And he's going to differentiate those things. In a simple way, like if you're just talking about your sensing, like, your awareness, you hear, you see, you smell, those things are all going on all the time. And you don't generally notice the difference between them. You just kind of get this thing as a whole, and you're not particularly aware of a multiplicity of different sensory registers. You just kind of get a whole. But at the same time, you clearly recognize that it's important that you have seeing and hearing, and you wouldn't confuse one with the other, right? So you recognize them to be essential and essentially different. And so upon reflection, you can say, yes, I recognize that the overall fabric of my experiential life is reflecting, kind of independent, or at least different or differentiatable contributions of sight, hearing, smell, and so on. So in a similar way, he's going to say that kind of thing about your experience as a whole, but it's not going to be at the level of dividing the senses. It's going to be about, he's going to mark out three really essential types of functioning that he's going to say are happening in a person. We're going to talk about more detail in a minute, but I'll just alert you to what he says now. This is at around 435e. He talks about, you see people reflecting a kind of spiritedness, which is that, willingness to fight, basically. There's willingness to fight. You see people who have a love of learning, and you see people who have a love of money, basically, love of earning, you might say, learning and earning, if you want to make a little poem. But a love of gain and so on. And he's saying those three things are coming out of different facets of your experiencing, different dimensions of your experiencing, roughly analogously to the way I was saying, sight and hearing and smell are different facets. So we'll come back to that. I'll start you with just the very beginning of this section. So this is at 435e. He says, we found these three classes in the city. Isn't it also the case that we're going to find a corresponding trio of functions in the soul, and that just as we're going to find these ways that those things are held together properly in wisdom, courage, and so on in the city, we're going to find an analogous thing in the soul. Don't we say that these same three divisions are found in this, that we found in the city, or we find here, because he says, when we were talking about spiritedness in the city, doesn't that only come from spirited individuals? And if we're talking about wisdom in the city, doesn't that come from wise individuals and so on? And so he says, surely those things haven't come from any other place. It would be ridiculous if someone should think that the spiritedness didn't come into the cities from those individuals who are just the ones with having this character, or the love of learning, or the love of money. And so basically what we're going to find is a division sort of in your soul that's kind of like the division of those essential functions in the city that we've just been talking about. And let me just make one more remark, and then I'll get on to time about what I want to talk about. It's pretty interesting, though, that Glaucon sort of says, I'm not sure, and Socrates says, well, in my opinion, we're actually never going to get a precise grasp on this on the basis of the procedures we're now using. We'd have to take a different, longer route. But then they say, no, let's stick with this one. So that's an interesting remark, right? Socrates there especially explicitly says, my view is the way we're doing this isn't actually going to quite get us the truth. That doesn't mean this is worthless, but it does mean maybe you'd need to think twice about this method and so on. And I've already been giving you some indications about that before. But anyway, so the point I wanted to make was just this. They're saying there's a comparable kind of division in you to that division we see in the city. So now we're going to come back to that in a second. or in a few minutes. Now I want to put aside that text and start with something else and just talk about what people are like, right? Because the thing I was emphasizing is that in a city, the city isn't automatically in harmony with itself, right? It's got a multiplicity of elements. It's both got different types of element, like the one type of craft versus the guardian's craft versus the auxiliary's craft, through three different orders of craft. And then also within the normal world of sort of economic functioning of crafts, there's a multiplicity of them. So, and then there are other things too. There are men and women, children and adults, and whatever else. There are lots of other differences that are integral to the city, but those are the ones essential at this level of this function of crafts that we've been talking about. And so the point is, those things are not automatically in harmony with each other. And that's an interesting idea, right? That a city, it can be spatially one. You can put a name on it. You can say, New York City or whatever. But that doesn't mean that it's just a unity in the way it acts, right? It can be just a multiplicity of people doing different things who happen to be in the same place, or it can be different kinds of factions fighting against each other, or there'd be it can be more or less unified. And the idea is that that's true of you too. That's true of of an individual person. So we saw a phenomenon of that right at the beginning of Book 2. So, this whole discussion came about because Glaucon came to Socrates and said, I wasn't convinced by your argument against Thrasymachus. Can you, try again to prove to me that it's better to be just? But I want you I want to read just a little bit of what he says there, because I think it points, I think it's a good description of what it's like to be a person. It points to something pretty telling. He says, right at the very beginning, he said, did you want to just seem to have persuaded us, or did you want to really persuade us? And Socrates says, well, of course I'd want to really persuade you. And then Glaucon says, well, I wasn't persuaded. And so he says, it seems to me, this is at 358b, it seems to me as though Thrasymachus, who ended up agreeing with what Socrates said in Book 1, it looks to me as though Thrasymachus, like a snake, has been charmed more quickly than he should have been. And that's an interesting image for what arguing or speaking can do. It's like snake charming. Interesting idea. Anyway, like a snake, he's been charmed more quickly than he should have been. Yet to my way of thinking, there was still no proof there. And then he says, so I desire to hear this presented compellingly. And so he goes on about how he wants to have it really be shown that it's good to be just because it's just, And then he says, near the end of C, right before D, and then into the beginning of D, he says, for Socrates, though that is not at all my opinion, i.e. the opinion that Thrasymachus has, and that's actually a very popular one. He says, though that's not at all my opinion, I am at a loss. I've been talked deaf by Thrasymachus and countless others, while the argument on behalf of justice, that it's better than injustice, I've yet to hear from anyone as I want it. So here's the interesting thing, right? He's saying, I've heard other people, I've been talked deaf by Thrasymachus. I've heard other people making arguments about why I shouldn't believe this. And the things they say sound kind of convincing, right? And then when I've heard people try to give counter arguments, as Socrates tried to do, he says, I actually haven't heard anybody come up with a convincing proof. So he's saying, at the level of argument, if he just had to evaluate the arguments, he'd be more swayed by what Thrasymachus says than what the defenders of justice say. It's a fair enough point, right? But notice what he says, for Socrates, though that's not at all my own opinion. So it's interesting that he's saying, I actually believe that it's better to be just. So I believe it's better to be just. But I think the arguments are more compelling that argue against that. So there you see something about a fundamental kind of division, because as he says, I am at a loss. He doesn't know how to proceed. Why? Because there are two things about him that speak to him in different ways. Like he has a basic belief that you should be just. Something in him makes it seem to him like it's better to be just. But he's also a thinking being, and when he hears the arguments, he thinks, man, that doesn't seem quite right. Surely you want to be someone who, in a lot of important ways, is swayed by argument. People roll out the evidence, they show out the logical connections, and they say, look, this has to be so. And you want to be swayed by that, That's kind of what science is about. So, the thing about argument is that it operates with logic, right? It operates with necessity. It shows you, if you say this and you also say this, well, then it's necessarily the case that this follows, right? Or if you say this, you can't say this because they contradict each other. So a person who's not swayed by argument seems pretty far from being in touch with reality. But now an interesting thing about Glaucon is he says, these arguments seem to be right, and yet they haven't convinced me. So yeah, we want him to be swayed by argument, and he is moved by it for sure. But the thing he draws attention to is that there's something in him, and probably something in all of us, that it responds to something other than argument. And so the thing about Glaucon is we see there is a tension in him. Something about him is drawn this way, something about him is drawn that way. He's not in a position to dismiss either one. And the consequence of that is that he's living a kind of contradiction. He is drawn both to believe and to disbelieve something. In what makes him him, he says this has to be right. But in what makes him him, this has to be right. Right? So Glaucon starts this off by showing us this fundamental division within himself, right? And we saw a hint of that when we talked about moderation as being stronger than yourself and so on. We talked about a similar kind of tension already. But I want you to think about that phenomenon and try to think about that in your own life. And you might think of some other kinds of examples. It's easy to wake up in the morning really being drawn by the idea that you want to quit smoking, or you want to lose weight, or you want to get fit, or you want to break some other bad habit. You don't want to go out drinking again tonight, or whatever it is. And you really mean it, right? It's not like just a passing idea. Like that is something at the core of you speaking up. And it's speaking up because, over the last 6 months you've got wrapped up in some ways of living that you really come to think, no, I don't want to do that. And you're sort of at the point of bursting, and this thing about you is rising up every morning and saying, okay, I'm not going to do that. And yet at 10 p.m. after you've had a hard day and you're kind of lonely at home and you need a break, the bar or whatever it is just seems like a magnet. And it's more like once again you see why it's compelling, and you think, oh yeah, what, I really should do that. That's totally the right thing to do. Right? And so you can find yourself over the course of the day being quite drawn. That's good. I want to use drawn because I want that kind of passive language. It's not about you choosing to do something. It's like what compels you. You find yourself drawn in these two contradictory ways. So I want you to just think of those things as this sort of phenomenon of a kind of tension in the self. And so now I just want to go pretty quickly through this middle section of Book 4 to talk about the way they work this out. So I already read that stuff about, where he introduces that idea that we have this division, these sort of things in ourselves. And then, so when he's talking about love of learning, or love of money, or spiritedness, he says at 436a, do we act in each of these ways as a result of the same part of ourselves? Maybe not part isn't quite the right word, but the same aspect of ourselves, the same dimension of ourselves. And the point, they're going to show that the answer is no, but even before they show it, you might think, yeah, when I look at those things, it might seem like there are different aspects of me that are being poked on, that are being drawn out. Anyway, but so he goes on to say that. So he says, he's going to identify three. He's going to identify three essential and essentially different dimensions of our experiencing that contribute to just that fabric of that single happening of what it's like to be you. And he's going to call them epithumia, which we'll translate as desire, thumos or spirit, and the calculating part, the logistikon or logismos. I was going to say these are three. It's not exactly three different things you do, because to some significant degree they're passive. You sort of undergo them, but they're essentially different dimensions of our experiencing all the time. Those are the ones he's going to name, and now he's going to actually just point to some experiences so you can see these two different things at work, and to see that there are different functions happening to you. He's going to show some other things that are exactly like the kind of thing I was just saying about the Glaucon case, or about the trouble you have, not going out to smoke marijuana or something like that. So he says at 437, right at the very end of A, right, basically at B, right at the beginning of B, he says, well, I'm actually not going to read through the whole passage, but basically I'll just give you the example. So he gives an example. He says, you're thirsty. So you have a desire for drink. You're really thirsty. But you also know that, I don't know, it's going to make you feel sick or something like that. You know that, and so you conclude, I shouldn't do that. Right? And the point there is simple enough. If all you had were, sort of your desires, like you'd go drink. But you have those, and you also have something else, which is this very self-conscious, reflective working out of consequences and analyzing circumstances and so on. And so your reflective apprehension and assessment of your situation leads you to conclude about yourself, as part of that whole situation. You think about that it's not practically or instrumentally unwise for you to do this. Yet you have this way in which it's not that you think, I would like to have a drink. You feel it, right? You are drawn towards drinking. So there's something in you that's already sort of pulling you towards the water, right? Or to use the image I used before, the water is almost like a magnet pulling you towards it. But there's something else in you that speaks against that. And, you depending on how you grew up, you probably have learned to some significant degree how to let that one stop the other. Maybe you haven't. Some people don't learn that very well. It doesn't mean they don't have those two things, but sometimes their reflective insight into the foolishness of their activities doesn't result in them not doing them, right? But often it does. But so the point there is you experience a tension in yourself between that which desires and that which calculates. They're both you, and who you are is kind of how you live out the relationship between those two. That's, and so there and that can change. You can get better or worse at it, And so the you, which is the thing that is how those things ultimately come together, can take different forms depending on whether you become a person who's more powerful and effective in wielding that calculating force, or whether you, I suppose, remain a person or become a person. I could go either way, I guess, who's always going to drive that desire train through, no matter what calculation says. So there he distinguishes those two. And his point is, you just have to look at familiar experiences to recognize there are really two different sources of motivation affecting you. And notice, sources of motivation doesn't mean exactly sources of information. It's not like there's you who's a observer and one thing sends a message to you that says, I think I would like this, and another thing sends a message to you that says, I think I would like this, right? That wouldn't be motivation. That would just be information. Right? But for you, it's different. The desire is you. You are already turning towards that thing, and you are already seeing the foolishness of it. Right? These are two things that are the existing of you that are happening simultaneously, and you live out a certain kind of tension there. And you learn how to negotiate and navigate that thing that is you differently, and either become someone who more learns how to steer it this way or more steer it that way. But then he says there's going to be another one, and so that comes up right after that, 439e. He says, okay, let these two forms in the soul be distinguished, logismos and epithumia. Now is the part that contains spirit and the part with which we are a spirit. Now, is that one a third? And the answer is going to be yes. Or he said, or would it have the same nature as one of those others? So to show it's going to be a third, you have to show it's not the same as desire, and you have to show it's not the same as calculation. So basically, he's going to show there's a situation where it can be in conflict with desire, and there's a situation where it can be in conflict with logismos, and that will show that it's neither one of those, but a third thing. And so he gives this quite interesting story of Leontius, who was coming up from the Piraeus one day, which interestingly is the same thing Socrates and Glaucon were doing at the beginning of the Republic. They were coming up from the Piraeus. I wonder if there's anything to note there, but anyway. But the story is this guy came up, and there were a bunch of dead bodies there from the executioner, and so he's coming up, and when he noticed corpses lying by the public executioner, he desired to look, but at the same time he was disgusted and made himself turn away. So that I could go on, and there are complexities in the language here if you look at the Greek and so on. But the basic difference is this notion of desire and disgust. I think the point there is that disgust is kind of like a sense of justice or a sense of what's shameful, to use the language that Socrates often used in the Apology. Remember when he said, don't worry about whether you live or die, but whether your action is just or shameful. But so the idea here is that you could have something like a sense of shame, a sense of what's just or a sense of what's unjust. And that's not so much a theoretical thing as something that is experienced, as we might say viscerally, as a feeling of disgust. But that's not the same as a desire. Like, he has the desire to do that, but he has another thing, which is it's not just the desire to look there and the desire to do something else. It's the desire to look there and the sense that it is wrong. Right? So it's not just a conflict of two desires, like you want this piece of cake, but you want that other thing also. Right? It's a desire and a different kind of attitude. And as he then wants to look, that feeling turns into anger. He gets angry at himself for looking, right? And he says, and he gets mad at his eyes, but in this case, desire wins, and he says, "Okay, eyes, go have your look, you filthy little beasts." So it's the higher road doesn't always win out against desire. But what he shows here is that desire doesn't just get carried out smoothly. There is this other thing, which is this desire to fight against it because it's unjust, and it makes him angry at himself. Well, we've seen that notion of anger and being, wanting to fight against what you feel is, being treated unfairly or being unjust or something like that, way back in Book 2 with that notion of thumos. So he says here in this little story, you see this idea of again, a different kind of reaction we have that's not desire, and we can have a conflict between that sense of shame that gets us riled up and angry. It's so very emotional. It's not thinking or calculation. It's a very emotional level, but it's about a value. There could be a conflict between that and the thing we actually desire to do. But then he also says, again, it's on the next page, it says it's not the same as logismos or calculation. He says, it's at 441a and b, how are we going to know this is not the calculating part? Socrates says that, and then Glaucon says, it's not hard for it to come to light as different from the calculating part. For even in little children, one could see that they're full of spirits straight from birth, while as for calculating, some seem to me never to get a share of it, and many get it late. So again, that's Glaucon's answer, so be careful about it. But I think the point, remains clear enough that, that point about children or about others, like people can respond out of rage or something like that, and that itself can be at odds with thinking and calculating. Like, maybe that's what you want to do when people are getting angry. You want to say, like, okay, you're angry, but try to think about this, because if you think about it, you can figure out that the situation is not actually the way it appears to your rage, or that rage, or it could be just like the don't have a drink because it's not a good idea. It could be like you calculate out, like, sure, you're angry, but you should try to stop being angry because it's gonna burn a bridge and you're gonna lose your job or something like that, right? As Glaucon says, it's not too hard to see that that's not the same as calculating. So anyway, that's all I wanted to bring out there. But when I say all, That makes it sound like small, but it's huge. It seems to me the differentiation of these three things is extremely powerful, insightful, important, and a lot comes from it. And this idea of distinguishing kind of three different dimensions that are always alive in the shaping of the fabric of our experience. This desire, right? The sort of immediate things we are drawn to or repelled by, that kind of immediacy of attraction and repulsion, something like that. And then a second thing, which is a sense of shame or justice or injustice that's wrapped up with willingness to fight for it. Now, that seems to me to have more to do with your sense of, again, your sense of yourself and what you stand for or what you're worth, right? You get mad when people don't give you what you're due, or so it seems to you, right? And you think that's injustice, right? So there's a different issue there that has to do with the violation of boundaries and so on. It's not so much about the immediacy of attraction and repulsion. It's about, it's kind of like that thing Socrates said about what you're willing to take a stand on, right? But that's different again from this other amazing power we have. And I don't know what else has it, what other animals have, and maybe some to a little degree, but we have it to a huge degree, and that's the ability to figure things out reflectively and logically, to calculate, right? Or maybe I can put it this way, would be better. To figure things out in a way that does not make reference to our personal perspective, to adopt that indifferent, impersonal perspective that can actually work out the logical relationships on their own terms without regard to how they happen to seem to you, right? That's a powerful skill. That's the thing that's called for in the law court when they say we want you to impartially assess the evidence and so on. So that's, again, a very different thing. So I want you to think about those three powers. As I say, I think it's a very compelling presentation of these different aspects of what's always going on in our souls. And then this that opens up a lot, because it's like those are things in you and they should be harmonized, but they're often going to be in conflict. And an awful lot about the question of whether you're happy and an awful lot about the question about whether you're a good person is going to come from how you got those three things relating to each other, So he's going to go on to say something like that. So we can talk about justice, wisdom, moderation, and courage. He talks about those in these later pages. And, he basically says wisdom is when that calculating part rules, Courage is when that spirited part is directed towards the right values. Moderation is interesting. He says something like the same kind of thing he said when he said in the city. He says moderation is when all of the parts of the soul agree about who the ruler should be. That I want to bring that back to the thing I said about stronger than himself or weaker than himself last time. I said there, that idea that you're controlling your desires. Maybe that explains why he uses this funny language of saying this gives us lets us see the traces of the moderation we're looking for, because I was trying to emphasize that if you are a person who has to use force to control your desires, which most of us do sometimes, I imagine, that's not exactly moderation. It's in the direction of moderation, but that's like a person who has to fight with himself or herself or themselves. It's like someone who actually hasn't fully become moderate, because your desires are running off in a different direction than everything else about you, right? So you got to fight with yourself. So when he defines moderation here as all the parts of the soul sort of agreeing about who should be the ruler, that makes it seem like the right thing, right? That your desires have themselves embraced kind of the rule. So in other words, you desire as a fair person, and you desire as a kind person, and you desire as a generous person. Right? It's not that you believe you should be generous and kind, and so you got to keep fighting against your desires to do other things. Many of us are in that situation. But a truly moderate person or a truly kind person would be someone who actually, at the level of his, her, or their desires, literally wants, not just intellectually, but immediately wants to share, wants to be kind, So And there's a very interesting story to think about there about sort of the education and transformation of your desires. But all I want to do is just point quickly to the thing he says about moderation. I think it's at 442c. Yeah, he says, isn't the person moderate? Isn't he moderate because of the friendship and accord of these parts, when the ruling part, which in this case would be calculation on this story, and the two ruled parts are of a single opinion, that the calculating part ought to rule, and they don't raise faction against it, right? So if you got to fight with your desires, then your desires are raising faction against calculation. Right? So true moderation would be all of those things actually having embraced the same values. So that's the thing for you to think about. But anyway, he goes through, he talks about moderation, courage, wisdom, justice, again, about every part doing its own business and so on. Like I said, those things are interesting and important. They're not, for my purposes here, I don't so much want to stress them. What I really wanted to stress was more that issue of thinking about just these different component parts of the soul. And I want to conclude just by looking at one last thing. And this is from book 6. Book 6, which we're about to go on to, is about the philosopher and about philosophy. What it takes truly to be a philosopher, and it's really great stuff. But they say, well, why would anybody want to be a philosopher? Aren't philosophers either people who walk around with their head in their clouds, saying things that nobody cares about, or else these vicious people who make the weaker argument the stronger and things like that? And Socrates says, that's in the middle of book 6, and Socrates says, that's what the people who've come to be called philosophers look like. That's what you see. That's what your university professors are like, or lawyers are like, or something like that. But he says that's not a true philosopher. A true philosopher, and I mean Socrates. It's not what Socrates is like either. And a true philosopher is actually a person who is fully committed to the good, effectively in every respect, and so on. We'll talk about more about that later. But anyway, so they've been talking about what it would take to be that kind of person, and they're saying, what kind of person is well set out to do that? And they're saying, well, you're going to need some stuff. Like, you're going to be more likely to be fit to become a true philosopher. It seems, at least this is how their conversation goes. And when you read their conversation, you might or might not think they went through the issues right. But the point they get to is, well, you'd want somebody who's smart. You'd want somebody who has a good memory. You want somebody who is wealthy enough that they don't have to focus their lives on scrambling just to get by, because that's going to force them almost certainly to do bad things. You're going to want people who have friends, and who have a nice supportive human environment. You're going to, so you can list all these things. Like, if you're really likely going to become, a well-developed person who's going to be single-mindedly devoted towards the good and all this sort of stuff, you're probably going to have had a pretty rich and healthy environment. Okay, so that's what they say. As I said, you might or might not agree with the analysis that gets them there. That's fine. But I wanted to say that just so you can follow the conversation. So at 491a, he says, right before B, a few lines before B, he says, now I suppose everybody will agree with us about this. Such a nature that possesses everything we described just now for the man who's going to be a perfect philosopher, such natures are few and come up only rarely in human beings, right? And Adeimantus, who's speaking now, says, yeah, that's right. And then Socrates says, now consider how many great sources of ruin there are for these few. And then he says, what is most surprising of all is that each one of the elements we just praised in that nature, the things that are going to make it good and be able to develop to be a true philosopher, each one of those things we praised in that nature has a role in destroying the soul that has them and tearing it away from philosophy. What parts do I mean? I mean courage, moderation, and all those other things we went through. And Adeimantus says, boy, that's strange to hear. And then Socrates says, and what's more, I said, besides that, all those other things that are said to be goods corrupt it and tear it away from philosophy. Things like beauty, wealth, strength of body, relatives who are powerful in a city, and everything like that, everything akin to these. And basically the thing he wants to say, the I want to encourage you to read that whole section that runs from, well, you've got to read it, from 491A to 494D. I'm not going to go through it in detail. I'm going to say a thing about it. I just wanted to read you that beginning, and then I'm just going to make a point about it to think about in relation to what I was already saying about book 4. The basic thing he's saying here is that, if you want to develop to be a good person, you're going to need some things and you're going to have to get there. But it's not like planting a seed in the ground and pouring water on it, right? It's not a natural occurrence. It's a situation of a human being developing in a human context. And there are all kinds of things that are going to be essential contributors to that successful development. But getting those things doesn't guarantee you're going to make it to the end of that successful development. And if you don't make it, those things that would have contributed positively might actually be negative. Like there's a saying, people say something like, a little bit of learning is a bad thing. I can't remember the exact idiom, but it's something like that. And the point is, generally speaking, you would think learning is a good thing. But what can happen is that people learn a little bit, but they haven't learned the whole. But then because they've learned a little bit, they think they know a lot, and they go around acting authoritative on that basis of that little bit of learning that they've done, when in fact what they have really kind of misrepresents things. And so what the position they end up standing for, the things they end up doing, are not the things that actually learned people would agree with, and they're also not the things that such a person would have done had he or she or they not gone through that learning. They're just doing things that are bad because they've been misled by this little bit of stuff that they got. That kind of story. And he's saying that kind of thing can happen a lot. That you could say that about going to university. You might think going to university is a good thing, and I certainly think it is. But you can see why people would be concerned sometimes that, and then people can say, here's what you'd get out of going to university, and you can say these nice things that could contribute to. Well, maybe you go to university and you don't do it in such a way that it's going to take you on those bigger paths, and it might just seem to just alienate you from the world you were going to belong to. It might make you unhappy, or maybe studying philosophy. Like maybe you're going to study Socrates talking about death, or Heidegger talking about death, and where that should be, inspiring, it might make you think, oh, life is worthless. And, maybe it's going to make you just have a little existential crisis, and you're going to lose all your friends, and maybe you're going to go kill yourself or something. Like maybe studying that is going to, it's not going to cause you to do something. That would be the wrong expression. It's not exactly causing, but in the context of reading it, you, being the person you are, take it up poorly and are affected by it in such a way that you go on and do things that are not good, but maybe you wouldn't have done them. Maybe you would have been better off if you'd never read it. Right? Those are just, off-the-cuff examples, but I'm just trying to give you this idea that there are things that could be good, but they're only good if they're taken up the right way, right? And that's why this, in as much as this is a human affair and not just a natural affair, it's not guaranteed that these things are going to, on their own, tend towards producing the result they're supposed to produce, right? People in their freedom have to take these things up properly. So I wanted to point to that passage just in connection with this stuff about tensions in the soul and so on, just to talk about just to raise these questions about the different things that are in you competing for authority, and that's at the level of the sort of constituent powers, desire, spirit, and calculating. But then also these other kinds of circumstances, even courage and moderation, which are the things that are coming from putting these things together in the right way, can throw you in the wrong direction. Like being courageous isn't a great asset if you end up using it in the service of bad things. If you have the wrong views about whether some other person is good or bad, and you think, I'm going to be courageous and defend that person, and that's actually a bad person, then your courage has made you a more powerful enemy of the good. So I just want you to think about this passage and those other ones to get you to start thinking about this question of thinking about a person, thinking about yourself, thinking about the different things that are sort of competing within you for basically controlling who you are, and the question of what you would want to be in the driver's seat, which is to say, who you would want yourself to be, or from what position you would want yourself to be driving. You want to be the driver, I guess, but you want to be a good person. So I want you just to think about those things and those issues. I just one more thing I just remembered that I wanted to end here. In that section I was asking you to read from Book 6, he then also goes on to talk about who or what forces, let's say, are responsible or playing a role in this idea of corrupting the young, or the person who could otherwise be good. And I just want you to look there at the point he's making about essentially popular opinion. Some people would say, oh, these sophists are going around corrupting people. And he says all they do is give voice to what is already popular opinion. And he says, look at these other circumstances where people communicate what they think is good and what they think is bad. And that's really what's going to shape people's perceptions. So I want you to look at that and connect that with the story about education in music and gymnastic, especially music, that we talked about in Book 3 and at the end of Book 2. And to think about what it is that is actually persuading these things in you. So we were talking about how music persuades you and so on. And now we've been looking sort of more formally at this division of the soul, and we can see, these are the things that are being persuaded, your spirit and your desires. So think about the way that things in popular culture are persuading those below the level of your reflective intentions, below the level of calculation, right? So that this thing at the end, it seems to me, pulls together quite powerfully this discussion of the divisions and tensions within the soul, and what it takes for us to develop in a healthy way, which is to say, making us both happy and good. To think about the relationship between that and the earlier discussion we were having in some considerable detail about our musical education, our cultural education. Okay, that's where I want to end it. We'll come back next time and talk about the rest of other things, especially at the end of Book 6, a little bit at the beginning of Book 7, and a little bit at the end of Book 5. And that's, among other things, going to take us ultimately just to talk a little bit about the nature of the good. And that will wrap up our study of the Republic. Okay, great.